morning, guys, and welcome to the fourth and final Reefs Go Live broadcast of 2022. Today is a special broadcast for World Ocean Day, and we're going to be looking at how we plan to restore healthy reefs for the future. I'm Jana, I'm a research technician here at CCMI, and I'll be your topside host for today. While underwater, we have our very own research director, Dr. Gretchen Goodbody. So without further ado, let's say hello to Gretchen. Hi, Gretchen.
Hi, everyone. As Jana said, I'm Dr. Gretchen Goodbody. Thanks for coming back to watch Reefs Go Live, and happy World Ocean Day. Today, our team is going to talk to you about all the threats that are impacting these corals that make up this massive and beautiful reef around me. What we as scientists are doing to help preserve and restore them, and what you can do as an individual to help us ensure that they're here for us in the future.
That's exactly right, Gretchen. We do have a team behind the scenes that I want to acknowledge who are helping make this Reef Go Live come together. So let's say hello to the team.
Hi, guys.
Hi.
Okay, so for the first time viewers, there's a welcome video on the landing page of the site, which walks you through asking questions and answering polls online. We want to encourage you to ask questions in our live chat to the right of the events page. And for the viewers at Cayman Bay Cinema, you should have received information of how to ask questions via WhatsApp. We hope to hear from everyone from around the world. Please tell us where you're tuning in from today. Please don't be shy. Gretchen, how are you and our underwater team doing down there?
We're doing great, Jana. We're excited to get started.
Alright, great to hear. Now let's get going with this live lesson. So, as many of you are aware, climate change is currently happening, and it's a result of burning fossil fuels through human activities such as electricity, putting fuel in our vehicles, and this is causing the climate to change rapidly. Now, as much as 90% of excess heat is absorbed by the ocean from these human activities. And while we see evidence for climate change very clearly in terrestrial environments such as melting glaciers, increased forest fires, increasing storm events, it's sometimes not that obvious how climate change is impacting coral reefs. So, Gretchen, can you elaborate on how climate change is impacting coral reefs for us?
Sure, Jana. Well, coral reefs have actually been around for thousands of years. In fact, some corals, like this beautiful star coral here beside me, which you can see is providing habitat for multiple different kinds of fish species and sponges and algae, including these tiny little fairy basslets, some gobies, and even these large Bermuda chub. And so these individual corals, when they're large like this, could have been alive for several hundreds of years, which means they've actually experienced a wide range of temperatures and variations in the climate. Now, what's interesting is that corals actually only are able to live within a very narrow temperature range. So that means that even just a change of 1 degree Celsius can sometimes cause corals to bleach and die. However, the susceptibility to these differences in temperature can differ among individuals, among reefs, among locations. And so understanding how temperature and climate is impacting these corals is very important to preserving them for the future.
That's right, Gretchen. So I just want to say hi to our viewers. We've got people tuning in from Turks and Caicos, Cape Cod, Long Island, New York, Woods Hole in Massachusetts, plus Saginaw Valley State who are with us at CCMI presently. We also have Island Montessori tuning in. So hi everyone. Okay, so we understand now that corals are threatened and that they're facing some challenges. Gretchen, why should we care about coral reefs? Why are they so important?
Oh my goodness, Jana. Corals are so important to us as humans, to our society, to the ecosystem for so many reasons. Not only are they the most biodiverse ecosystem in the marine environment, but they also provide a myriad of goods and services. So, for example, coral reefs actually built the island that we live on here in Grand Cayman and Little Cayman, as well as the Cayman brack. But in addition to that, they support us in terms of our livelihood. They provide food from fishing. They support our major economic driver, which is tourism. And they also protect island nations from major storm damage and from wave action. And even sometimes we can get very important medical products or pharmaceutical products from organisms that live on the reef. And therefore, corals in general are just critical to the survival and sustainment of island ecosystems and all nations that border coral reefs.
Yes, they're all really important reasons to care for the future of our coral reefs. Gretchen, how are you and the underwater team doing down there?
We're doing great, Jana. We're excited.
Awesome. So we've covered why coral reefs are so important, yet also the fact that they're threatened. Gretchen, can you talk about the strategies that are being used to try and help corals survive into the future?
Yeah, well, scientists and conservationists were actually gardening coral reefs in what we call nurseries. So we'll take tiny little fragments of corals and we raise them in our garden, which is somewhat similar to, say, for example, a greenhouse on land. We tend to these corals, we make sure they're happy, they're healthy, they're not competing with other things, and then we eventually outplant them out onto the reef to restore populations to what they used to look like historically. And this process is called coral restoration.
Okay, Gretchen, that leads us quite nicely onto CCMI nurseries. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about those. CCMI nurseries were established in 2012 through the support of the Cayman Islands Department of Environment. Now, in these nurseries, we primarily grow staghorn coral or Acropora cervicornis. And there's two reasons for this. The first reason is that this coral is critically endangered in the Caribbean, which for reasons we'll later discuss. But the second reason is because this coral has a very fast growth rate, so it makes it perfect for growing in the nursery. Now, CCMI have been conducting various research projects, not only to look at the best ways of growing them in the nurseries, but also how to outplant them on the reef to ensure that they have a high survival rate. So this research is actually what I was primarily hired to work on at CCMI, and it's a resin bid grant funded by the European Union. Gretchen, what challenges do coral nursery managers face when they return corals back onto the reef?
Well, Jana, unfortunately, this is one of the steps that is the major hurdle to the success of coral restoration. And this is because when the corals are living in our nursery, they're in a wonderful habitat, they're constantly cared for and tended to. The algae is cleaned off of their racks and anything that settles onto their skeleton is removed. They're also in a wonderful environment that's perfect for them, right? So they're getting a lot of flow, they're getting a lot of nutrients, there's plenty of light, there's no competition, and in general, this just means they're very happy and comfortable. Now when we take those from the nursery, we put them back out onto the reef, now all of a sudden, they're dealing with things like competition from, say, a sponge like this, or algae like this, or this, right? And those things are competing with the corals that we've just outplanted onto the reef for space, for food, for light. And In addition, the corals are no longer being tended to. They're fighting for their own at that point. And so what happens is that, unfortunately, we see a very high mortality rate once the corals have been outplanted onto the reef within the first 2 years.
Okay, Gretchen, that is such a shame. A lot of effort goes into growing corals in nursery, and we want that to have a positive impact on the reef. We need to be able to grow, monitor, and understand how to keep corals healthy. Just like we do, corals need a comfortable environment in which to live, but also plenty of food.
That's right, Jana. And in fact, those two things are actually tied together, because corals actually receive over 90% of the food that they need from a symbiotic relationship with algae that live inside of them. These algae use the sun to produce energy, which they translocate to the coral host. Now, those algae give the coral its beautiful color. So, for example, this beautiful green great star coral is primarily this color because of the algae that live within it. If, however, the habitat becomes uncomfortable, so, for example, it's too hot, those algae get kicked out of the coral by the parent, the coral, and the coral becomes white or bleached and can die. So it's very important that the habitat is comfortable and they get plenty of food, because if they don't, they're stressed and they become vulnerable to things like disease. And thus, it's really important to understand how the environment and how
the structure of the reef, but also how it functioned. And in 2019, CCMI identified this disease in the nurseries. So they were able to identify which corals had got the disease and experienced mortality, those that got the disease and recovered, and those that didn't get the disease. So we now use the corals identified as resilient to white band disease in our restoration efforts, specifically outplanting corals that show a lower susceptibility to getting this disease.
That's right, Jana, because corals, like any living thing, are vulnerable to infection from bacteria and viruses that might cause disease. However,
in 8 individual corals or genotypes, and we subjected them to thermal tolerance tests in the lab. We placed them in individual chambers and exposed them to a range of temperatures from 28 to 37 degrees Celsius. We then measured oxygen production by the symbiotic algae, and then the oxygen consumption by the coral animal under each temperature. If consumption was more than production, the coral is not meeting its energy demands. It's therefore stressed and hungry. Hangry.
Hangry. That's right, Jana. And so what we did after that is we took those corals, so individuals that may have been more or less tolerant to heat, as well as individuals that showed different resilience to disease, and we took them and outplanted them onto the reef in what we call a common garden experiment. That means that all of those individuals from our laboratory experiment were then subjected to the same environmental conditions onto our elevated dome structures.
So Gretchen, can you explain to our dive buddies why we are using these dome structures?
Sure. So using these dome structures is actually really important for several reasons. So first of all, if we put the corals onto a dome, it's actually mimicking the natural reef structure. So if we look at the reef over here behind me, you can see that this is not flat. There's a lot going on, a lot of relief, a lot of things that come up off of the bottom, and that provides habitat for different kinds of species, as well as places to hide, for example. So when we use our domes to outplant corals, we're simulating that environmental feature. but as well, we're creating habitat for other organisms. So we also tend to find that little things like damselfish like to live in and among our domes. But probably, and the most important thing about using the domes is that our previous research has found by using domes instead of outplanting directly onto the reef floor, we were able to increase the survival of our outplants over 10 times.
Okay, Gretchen, that's pretty incredible. We do have some questions that have come in. So we have a question from Joe in London. How do we work to maintain diversity on the reef?
Oh, that's a great question, Joe. So, one of the ways that restoration practitioners are working to increase diversity is not just by increasing genetic diversity within the individuals that we outplant, but also by using restoration techniques for multiple species that have been impacted over time. Our goal is to recreate historic reefs to what they used to be before human impacts have altered them.
Okay, Gretchen, we have another question. What can we do to help the corals when they are on the reef from Y4 East End Primary School?
Sorry, what can we do to help corals?
When they're on the reef.
Oh, after they're on the reef. Great question. So this is something we often talk about here with Reefs Go Live. So in order to help the corals that are on the reef, one of the biggest things you can do is not touch them. Corals have a very delicate microbiome. So that means all the environment and the bacteria that live within them is very, very delicate. If you touch it, it can actually disrupt them in a major way. And so we tried not to touch the corals.
Okay, so what do we do now that we've outplanted these corals on the domes, on the reef? What is the next steps in this research, Gretchen?
This is actually the really exciting part, Jana. So once we have done this research, we outplant them onto the domes. We're then going back and taking hundreds and hundreds of photos of all of the domes and every single little coral, and we use specialized software to create three-dimensional models of our domes. Once we have this three-dimensional model, we can then follow the growth of these corals over time, as well as differences in things like bleaching or potentially signs of disease. And generally over time that gives us a measure of overall health and survival.
That's so interesting. That leads us to our next couple of questions from the audience. So Abby from SVSU wants to know if corals have an immune system.
Well, of course, it's a great question, but of course corals have an immune system. They're an animal just like we are, and so they have a whole series of mechanisms that help them tolerate things like stress, changes in light, changes in ocean chemistry, and give them the basic immunity to help them tolerate that.
Excellent, Gretchen. We also have another question from Olivia at the same place. She wants to know how long will you keep corals in the nursery before they are outplanted?
Well, that's an interesting question because it depends on the growth of the individual in the nursery. We generally try to keep our corals in a smaller size. So as soon as they start getting quite large, we take a chunk off of them, a large branch, and we use that branch for outplanting. So in fact, the main corals in our nursery have been there quite a long time, and just parts of them are contributing to all of our outplanting efforts.
Gretchen, I love the fact that we're carrying out such innovative and interesting research with the aim of having a positive impact on the coral reefs. Seeing the increased survival rates of our outplants over the past few years really does give us a hope for coral reefs for the future. So Gretchen, how will this study impact coral survival beyond Little Cayman?
Well, outreach is one of our main agendas with this project, and so it's so important for us to share our results across the region and across the globe. By sharing what we have found of our results with other people doing coral restoration in the Caribbean, we can help them improve their success rates. So, in general, this project has the capacity to increase the resilience of global coral reefs.
That's pretty incredible, but I do need to point out that the future doesn't just depend on scientists. Coral restoration on its own will not save our reefs. So, Gretchen, let's talk about how everyone can help protect coral reefs for the future.
That's right, Jana. It's not just up to us to save the coral reefs. Everyone can do their part by just making small little changes or huge lifestyle changes. Everything we do has an impact. So it's not up to just conservationists or enforcement officers. It's up to us, and it's up to you. So we are really excited to hear from you, our virtual dive buddies, on what you are doing to be a positive steward for the environment. Use the chat on the right of your screen to tell us what each and every one of you have done in your daily lives to make a difference.
Okay, Gretchen, while our virtual dive buddies do that, we do have another question. This is from Alia at Village Montessori. What kinds of fish are dangerous for the reefs?
Are dangerous for the reef? Well, as long as they belong here, they're not dangerous. So, my response to that would be the lionfish, because it doesn't belong in the Caribbean.
Okay, so Gretchen, let's check in before we end this broadcast. How are you and the underwater team doing down there?
Everyone's okay, just dealing with a little bit of current.
Okay, that's great. Alright, so I just want to talk about some small changes that we can do individually that have a big difference. So, if you really focus on looking at your power bills, it can actually have a really good impact on the planet. So if you higher the temperature that your air conditioning is set at and lower the temperature that your heating is set at, this not only is good for the planet, but it's also good for your power bills. And, just 1 or 2 degrees closer to the outside temperature lowers the energy used in homes, but also burns less fossil fuels. And other options for burning less fossil fuels is taking part in carpooling, taking public transport, and even beneficial for physical fitness, walking and cycling where possible. And not only do we need to think about how we transport ourselves, but also how food is transported. So, the greater the distance that food has to be transported, the more fossil fuels it burns. So that's why it's really good to support local farmers wherever possible. Gretchen, do you have anything else to add to this?
Of course, I just want to thank everyone for viewing, and also thank all of our virtual dive buddies for everything that they're doing to have a positive impact on the environment. It's so important to protect this beautiful, beautiful reef. I just want to point out these wonderful little blue-striped grunt, this chub, a schoolmaster snapper, all just living here happily together on our gorgeous coral reefs.
That's pretty rad, Gretchen. So we have a few questions and comments. The Cayman Learning Centre wants to know what happens if you hit a coral while it's alive.
If you do what to a coral?
If you hit a coral while it's alive.
If you hit it?
Yeah.
Well, please don't hit a coral. That's not a great thing to do. It could in fact kill the coral, and it might even cause a little sting to you.
Okay. And Emma from SVSU wants to know if you're not supposed to touch the corals. How are they outplanted as well?
Oh, well, that's a great question, and you probably saw from our video that we use gloves when we transplant our corals. That's so that our bacteria does not interact with the bacteria of the coral.
Okay, excellent. So grade 2 from CIS are saying, are there any certain fish that can help the coral too?
Oh, yeah. There are loads of fish that are critical to the health of the coral reef. Probably, and what's talked about the most, are the parrotfish. And that's because they eat all the algae that's growing on the bottom of their reef. And they keep the reef clean. They remove some of that competition I was talking about between algae and coral. And so there's a lot of evidence to show that reefs that have a lot of parrotfish don't have a lot of algae and sustain high coral cover. Let's see if we can find a parrotfish around here.
Okay, Gretchen, grade 2 at CIS have done a beach clean, so that's how they're helping out to have positive impacts for the future of our coral reefs. That's pretty cool, right?
Yeah, that's excellent. We do a lot of beach cleans here at CCMI.
Okay. So they were all excellent questions and suggestions of how we can help keep reefs healthy for the future. Any last minute questions before we recap today's live lesson?
Jana, this is your producer Beth here. I'm just going to jump in and say, why don't you do a recap and we'll see if we get any more questions to come in from our viewers.
Okay. So we started on how human activities are causing climate change and that this is making it difficult for species survival, such as coral. We talked about CCMI's efforts in coral restoration, growing corals in nurseries, returning them onto the reef to restore them over a period of about 10 years. We then talked about our very cool research where we're testing coral tolerance to warmer oceans and disease with the goal to help corals survive into the future. And despite these facts and threats, we absolutely believe that there's hope for our planet's future. And finally, we have suggestions of how every person can contribute in a positive way to the health of coral reefs now and into the future. So that's it from us, Gretchen. Any last words for our dive buddies?
You know what? I'm going to jump in here. This is your producer, Beth, and we've got some questions coming in fast and furious. So
Great.
I'm just going to read some of those off to you, Gretchen. Rosie from CIS would like to know how much coral there is in the ocean, which is a big question.
Oh, wow. Well, in the whole ocean, there is a lot. You know, coral reefs actually only make up about 1% of the Earth's surface. However, they sustain a much larger amount of biodiversity, as you can expect.
Yeah. Now, also we have a question from Leo at CIS who wants to know, what's your favorite fish, Gretchen?
What's my favorite what?
Fish.
Ooh, that's a hard one. One of my favorite fish is the spotted drum. It's got this beautiful little hat on the back of it that I just think is phenomenal. Every time I see one, especially a juvenile, I get really excited about it. Probably unreasonably excited.
They are really cool looking. We've got a couple of suggestions that have come in from Saginaw Valley as well. They are minimizing their carbon footprint by using reusable bottles and mugs and buying vintage clothing and also decreasing their meat intake. What do you think about those suggestions, Gretchen?
Oh, all of those are just absolutely fantastic. Did you know that, in fact, the carbon footprint of agriculture is higher than the carbon footprint of the entire aviation industry? Which means that if you and your family strive to eat less meat, you're having a more positive impact than if you gave up flying in planes.
That is a pretty massive impact, right, Jana?
Yeah, that
Sure
is
is.
incredible.
We've got a couple more questions coming in, and I'm just going to take them because they're coming in quick. What can we do to prevent global sea temperature rise?
Oh. Well, probably the biggest thing that we can do as a community is work together to strive for change. Strive and talk to your local government about being net zero carbon. Try to reduce your carbon footprint in any way possible. And that can be from eating less meat, to riding your bike more often instead of going in a car, to turning your thermostat closer to the outside temperature. All of these very small things that you can do add up to big differences.
Alright, Gretchen, we've got another question from Village Montessori. Is there any particular place on the earth that is sustaining the most rapid bleaching?
Oh, well, right now, unfortunately, I'd have to say that it's probably the Great Barrier Reef. And in particular, the northern section of the Great Barrier Reef, which recently has been hit by annual mass bleaching events. And so that particular location is quite vulnerable at the moment. Interestingly, it doesn't seem to have to do with necessarily the hot places that have always been hot are bleaching more. A lot of times it has to do with what the range of temperature is that those corals have been exposed to over time, and if they're able to deal with that.
Okay, so, and we have more questions. So, Charlotte from CIS would like to know what the largest type of coral is.
Ooh, well, I mean, I have seen corals personally the size of a VW bug. Some of our younger viewers might not even know what that is, but it's a small little car. And that's because those corals can be several hundred years old. So actually, some of the largest corals that I've seen are representatives of the species right here in front of me. This is called Siderastria. I believe it's the lesser star coral is the common name, as well as the Montastria, which I pointed out earlier. Here's an example here of Montastria down there. And those boulder corals can get massive.
Okay, that's awesome. So we have another question from Connor at CIS Grade 2. He would like to know, does anything eat lionfish?
What eats lionfish?
Yeah.
Well, some sharks, some groupers, and it's actually taken a while for predators here in the Caribbean to recognize lionfish as prey, but it seems that they're starting to catch on. We have some evidence now that groupers do in fact eat lionfish, as well as some sharks.
Alright, and how many different types of parrotfish are there? This is from Stephanie.
Ooh. Off the top of my head, there's about a dozen species in the Caribbean of different kinds of parrotfish. We've got queen, princess, stoplight, striped, green blotch. What else? Loads of them.
Okay, yeah, that was quite a few. So Gretchen, any last words for our dive buddies?
I just want to thank you all for spending your World Ocean Day with us today. I feel so fortunate to be able to be here on the reef where I love to be. It's obviously my happy place, and it's such a joy to spend World Ocean Day and share it, this wonderful, beautiful, and important environment with all of you. So thank you.
Yes, thanks again for joining us for the final broadcast of this year. We hope that you learned a lot, and please keep in touch with CCMI, follow us on social media, subscribe to our newsletter, take part in our camps, courses and events. And, you know, it is really interesting to explore and learn about our corals and how there's so much that's worth protecting. So thank you for taking part in our We Hope to Secure Healthy Corals for the Future. See you in 2023. Bye!